Hey everyone! So guess what? We are here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, Lynn and I, and we're going Facebook Live because we thought we would give you a little treat into the insight, I guess, of writing The Copper Phoenix, which is coming out on March 30th. And it's not very often that I get to be with my best friend here, Lynn Thomas. So we're going to go Facebook Live and we're going to just chat a little bit about your book. Are you excited? Are you ready?
I am.
All right. So why don't you tell us a little bit about The Copper Phoenix? What's the premise?
So The Copper Phoenix is the story of my childhood and all of the abuse and sexual trauma I went through until I was about 15. And then I met a wonderful man who helped me in my recovery to realize that I wasn't trapped in that situation, and he made me really understand that I could change the direction of my life, but that it was up to me to make the difference and to heal. But to do that, I had to work through the pain and not let all of the people who had abused me take away my light.
So why now? Like, why are you deciding to release this book?
You know, oddly enough, over the years, as I told snippets of my life to people, many people suggested I should write a book about it. But I don't think I was ready in my earlier years, my 20s, 30s, even in my early 40s, to make such painful things about my life public, right? And I knew if I was going to write a book about my life, or if there was going to be a book written about my life, that I had to claim it. And I wasn't ready to claim it publicly yet. Some of the trauma was, and some of the things that I went through were hard enough to survive at the time, and working through all of that to get healthy was, I thought, enough. But at this point in my life, I want others to understand that might be in those situations, young teens, even housewives who are trapped in abusive relationships, that you can get out, you can have a better life, you own your life, they don't.
Yeah. So most people who've gone through a lot of trauma, there is this 40-year span before they're able to talk about it. Even with me as a Vietnamese, Vietnam War survivor, and going through some of the trauma that I've been through, it's taken 40 years to actually be able to write my story or my mom's story, right? Do you feel like that's the same for you?
Yeah, I think, first of all, there's the dive into the trauma and the dealing your way through it. And then there's, getting healthy. And I think it just takes years to be able to be comfortable enough in our generation as children and as young adults, these things weren't talked about, right? You had to hide your shame, basically. And for me to get to a place where I was comfortable enough to really internalize, it's not my shame.
How did you get there, though? Because some people never get there.
Right. Well, I think Wally helped. Wally was a huge help to me in understanding that, look, you're not responsible for what happened to you. You were a child. You were young. You couldn't have gotten out of those situations had you tried, right, at that age, because all of the people who abused me, both physically, emotionally, sexually, they were all adults, right, or for the most part. And that I wasn't responsible. And that makes it not my shame. It's really their shame. Their shame because they chose to get joy out of hurting people. And in this case, me specifically, right?
So for those who don't know who Wally is,
Wally is the man who, when I first got into recovery, look, all of that trauma turned me in my early teens into drugs and alcohol and acting out. And at about 15, my best friend went into treatment, and she and I were incredibly close, and I was scared to lose her. So when she came out, her grandmother told her she couldn't see me anymore. She lived with her grandmother, and I didn't want to lose her, so I told her I would get into a recovery program. And I met Wally right after getting into the recovery program. And he often took me to 12-step meetings. We'd drive around the countryside. I did grow up in the Midwest. Much of this takes place in Rochester, Minnesota. And so we would drive to these little towns and these little meetings, and it was a 30-minute drive, 30-minute drive. And so we talked a lot. And at first, he just had to get me to open up. So it was very general topics, music. But over time, he and I became close enough that he took me to family events. He took me on, he was a commercial bus driver, and he did long trips. So, for example, he had a group of lawyers that wanted to go to the Twins game. He drove them up there, and he was allowed to take me with, and he just told them I was his daughter. And so he and I would sit in the front of the bus and chat. And then during the game, right, we had hours to just sit and talk. And he never tried to, I think the way he was able to reach me is that he never came at me in an abusive way. He never tried to parent me. It wasn't a parent-child kind of relationship, even though he was 52 when we met and I was 15. It was more of a mentorship, right? Mm-hmm. And it was, he didn't tell me what to do. He guided me by making me rethink the way I had been thinking about things, by asking me open-ended questions. I recall one time we were sitting in a Perkins, and I had gotten myself into a bit of trouble relapse like the weekend before, and I asked him, I was like, "Are you worried about me landing on my feet?" And he said, "I never worried that whether or not you're going to land on your feet. I wonder which direction you're going to go. Are you going to head towards, the dark side? Are you going to, let this win? The drugs, the alcohol, all of the things you've been doing? Or are you going to take control of your life and stop letting them, have control? You have your control."
Yeah.
Well, and I would try to answer him and say, I don't want an answer. I want you to think about that for a while.
So then you were in your own head.
So then I was in my own head. Yeah, a lot.
And you had to confront all the things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's back it up a little bit for those who don't know anything about the Copper Phoenix or anything about your story, because yours is an incredible story. We hear about women who are in abusive relationships, women who are sexual survivors, all this other dysfunctional stuff in the family. But what makes your story really interesting and really unique, in my opinion, is that you were kidnapped when you were a baby.
Right.
You have over 30 siblings. There's so much to this story. Why don't you tell us more about what your story is about?
Yeah, so my father was this unique, crazy, narcissistic. I won't say a narcissist because I'm not a psychiatrist, but very, very narcissistic in his thoughts and behavior. And, I think that he hated women. He was married a total of 10 times. And had, because he believed in marriage, right? But eventually he was abusive. He was an alcoholic, and he had sexual practices that his wives couldn't tolerate after a time. They just wouldn't put up with it. And so they would take whatever kids they'd had together and leave him. My mother was his seventh wife. And when I was born, my mother already had 4 kids. She had been married, I'm the product of what could be an affair, but that they eventually got married because she was pregnant with me. And my mother was more twisted, I think, than even my father.
How so?
I like to say my father was immoral. He did bad things, but he knew what he was doing was wrong. My mother's amoral, twisted enough that she doesn't believe anything she does is wrong. And my mother was a pedophile. She liked to go after teenage kids and have tried to develop relationships with them, including sexual. And to me, that is just horrifying, right? Not to mention she was an addict, and She, got all her kids addicted to drugs when they were young, elementary school, 6, 7 years old. She had them dealing for her when they were in middle school, right? And after my father took me, she was declared unfit by the state, and all her kids were taken from her. She did manage to get the kids back over time for various reasons, but not because of the state. She ended up actually moving out of that state to another state. Once she got the kids back, she ran so that she could keep the kids, right? So my mother and my father were oil and water, just oil and water. They didn't mix. He didn't believe in drugs, but he drank his tail off. She drank her tail off, but she wanted her drugs because they made her feel good. And she wasn't going to put up with his sexual practices. He liked threesomes, and she was tired of him trying to bring other women into their, marital relationship. And he was abusive, and she didn't like that either, right? Understandably so. But she was pretty twisted herself and abused her kids as well. She couldn't abuse him because he was too big and too strong. Yeah. So they eventually split, and I think my father took me because he realized how sick she was, and I think he felt that he was infinitely better as a parent than she could ever possibly be. So what he did was he tricked her by not signing the divorce papers, but calling her and telling her they were divorced. So she remarried. And then he came at her with, you're a bigamist. And she immediately got that marriage annulled, but then he took me. And he used that as leverage for her not to ever come find me.
Wow. So how long did it take for you to reconnect with your mom again?
Well, my father, as sick as he is, anytime when I was little, very little, say under 5, he would, we traveled the country, he and I, all over the western half of the U.S., and he would often pass by where he knew she was going to be. And so he'd say, hey, let's get together and so you can see your daughter. And I didn't learn this until much, much later, until I was, a late teenager, young adult, that he would coerce her into going out with him and having sex with him before he'd allow her to see me. Right? Wow. And then she'd get to see me for a short time, and then we'd be on our way. It was always just a one afternoon, evening kind of thing, but the next morning we were out of town. And he never let her know where we were going. He kept track of her, but he wouldn't allow her to keep track of where he was at. And back then it was so much easier to do that. It was much easier to get away with the kidnapping because we didn't have all the technologies and the technologies that we do now. Right? And so, she was too afraid of him. She didn't want to go to jail and lose her other kids. He kind of made it this, you lose all your kids and you lose her. Your choice. And I think she felt stuck in a no-win situation. So she let me go, like by not looking for me, etc. So
you were born October 1971.
Yes, October 1971.
And the bulk of all of this happened in the book in the early 80s. Is that correct?
Early, late? We go from the 70s, into the mid 80s-ish in the book until I'm about 15, which is when I got into recovery. And then we talk a little bit about my recovery, later in the book. But I think the bulk of this is to get you to understand you can go through massive trauma, because we do cover a lot of that in the book. And then even with massive trauma, you can recover and have a great life. Right? So we try to cover a little of both, but there is that understanding of, I wanted people to understand the trauma that I had been through, because I want them to understand that no matter what they've gone through, they're valued, they're valuable, that what happened to them is not their shame. Even adult women in abused relationships, right? It's so easy to be tricked by a narcissistic person or mentally messed up person. And it's sometimes that abuse is very subtle at the beginning, and you don't see it until it's too late.
Well, a lot of the physical abuse was from your dad.
Well, and a stepmother. I had a stepmother who was pretty brutal. She hated me from the get-go. And then, yes, my father, the difference was my father was able to pick me up and throw me around, and his punches were a lot more damaging than hers. physically anyway,
What
and
was-
psychologically, because he was my actual dad. She
Right.
was just
the person who's supposed to
stepmother.
protect you, and
Yeah.
yeah.
He was supposed to be my protector, right? And when I was young, we were incredibly close, and he treated me amazingly well. He was always a strict daddy when I was little, but there wasn't any abuse. And that's true, I think, with a lot of narcissistic parents, that because for a young child, their parent is the world, but as they grow up and start to form their own opinions, that's when you start to have problems, right? Because the narcissist doesn't like that you're not turning back exactly the sunshine that that they think they're supposed to be in their life.
Right.
Right.
Where's your father now?
He's deceased.
And your mother?
Also deceased.
So what family do you have?
I have a lot of siblings all over the country.
Let's talk a little bit about your siblings.
About my siblings. So, I have two brothers in Minnesota that I have reached back out to, I think, after a number of years from my dad's last wife. And we're redeveloping a relationship, and that's going very well. My oldest son has become very close to one of his uncles, which is very gratifying because the two boys turned out to be pretty healthy individuals, which I'm grateful for. I also, after 40 years, had a sister reach out to me that I hadn't seen since she was a year and a half. She and I have quite a bit in common, and we're starting to try to build a relationship as well. We've met each other several times now, and I've been to her house, she's been to mine, and we're taking it carefully, but her mother was the abusive stepmom in the book, and it turns out that she also no longer has a relationship with her mother because of how messed up her mother is.
And that mother is still alive?
She is. She lives in Wyoming. Yeah, married, but this particular sister ended up being the scapegoat after her mother left my father. Yeah.
So you mentioned your son, and I believe you have two sons,
I
right?
do, yes.
And there was a point where you were told you couldn't have children.
Yeah, when I was 15. I was 15 when I was first told I would never have children.
And why couldn't you have children?
Because I had been sexually assaulted very brutally, pretty young, and there was damage done to my uterus, and I had some scarring, and they ended up having to take out one of my fallopian tubes, and the other was pretty scarred. It was like 70% blocked, so the doctors thought that I would never really have kids. I did manage to get pregnant, but kept miscarrying, and so there was one doctor at March Air Force Base when I was in my mid-20s who thought that I had a maternal autoantibody immune deficiency. So whenever I get pregnant, my body would attack the baby as if it was like an illness or something, a foreign object. And we never were able to prove that. But given that once I married my husband, who is the first man I've ever felt really safe with, that I was able to get pregnant and carry, I think that there might be some truth to that. Because when I finally felt safe, I was able to get pregnant and carry to term.
Wow, which is a miracle, because
Yeah.
you and I have had offline conversations about what it took to have these two miracle babies, and the fact that half a dozen or more doctors from all over the country tell you the same thing. You'll never have kids. Give up. Like, don't even try. You're going to kill yourself, right? If you have. But you're also one stubborn woman.
I'm very stubborn. And
Which is,
look, medicine has come a long way, but we don't know everything, right? And doctors don't know everything. If we did, we wouldn't continue to make strides in learning. And there's no accounting for the human spirit. I just refuse to give up. Now, I'm not saying that that's true of everyone who's infertile, because some people, even not giving up, may not be able to have children. So while it's not true for everybody, if you give up, you've lost. If you don't give up and keep trying, you could win. That's the point, right?
Yeah. So let me ask, why did you not write the book yourself? A lot of people will say, "Oh, I'm not a writer," or whatever, but they're still capable to journal or write a memoir. Why did you choose to have someone else write your book?
I think because I know. Look, honestly, straight up, I know that some of this book was incredibly hard for you to write. But for me, it's not about, it wouldn't have been about writing. Some of the chapters you found the hardest to write would have been debilitating for me, because it wouldn't just be writing the chapter, I would go into a flashback and relive it.
Yeah.
And that was too intense for me. Flashbacks are incredibly difficult to deal with, and I've managed in my life to create a life where I don't have many of those anymore. And I don't like to put myself in situations that will constantly put me in flashback.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. So what are some of your triggers now, or do you still find that you have those
I do have triggers. I not that they've been triggered for a long time, but for example, early in our marriage, my husband was playing a prank on me and locked me in the pantry, and I went into a full-blown flashback from my stepmother, who used to lock me in the closet, lock me in the attic for hours on end, and he didn't know about it at the time. So he thought it was funny, and I just full-on panicked and kicked the door open, and he couldn't understand why. And so then I had to explain to him why I had flashbacks. I can't be held down. If somebody tries to hold me down or restrict my movements, I'll go into flashback.
Yeah.
Right? And there are others, but those are a few.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want to go over every one.
Sure, of course. So what do you want from this book in terms of the readership?
I'm hoping that this reaches people who need it, who are stuck in those situations for now, to understand that even if you can't get out right at the moment, you can start to take control of your life and eventually get away from the people who are abusing you, and face what happened to you, without bearing the shame that doesn't belong to you. And that you can have a good, healthy life. You just have to work through those demons to get healthy.
Yeah.
Right? Because you've grown up in such a dysfunctional environment that many times we internalize their actions as normal. Right? It becomes normalized, all this abuse. And it must be my fault. And it's not your fault. Right? If you're a child being abused by your parents, being restricted, being beaten, it's not you, it's them. And it's often incredibly hard for, I think, a lot of people to be able to free themselves from their parents and not need that parental validation. Right? Even as adults, I know many adults who still work hard to crave, work really hard to get parental validation from parents who are sick and are just not going to give it to them, because it's not you, it's them, right?
Yeah.
Look, anyone can have a child, but that means a lot of sick people have children that shouldn't have children. Now, don't take me wrong, I'm glad I'm alive, but and there are children who don't get out, who are, abused to death when they're little and they don't have any way out. But if I can reach some of these teenagers and young people, and to help them understand that what you're going through is temporary and that you can get out of it and you can create a healthy life for yourself. But even if that means distancing yourself and going no contact with those parents for life. I mean, I had to go no contact with my parents for years and years. And, at one point, I reasoned that I could have a surface relationship with my father, but it had to be strictly on my terms. And that meant I had to live far away from him.
Yeah. I'll tell you, you and I met at T-Mobile when we were in the legal affairs, corporate governance and securities team, working with our senior leadership team and our board of directors. And I mean, instantly, I felt like we had a bond.
Yeah, we did. We connected really quickly.
Which is hard to do for both of us, I think, because I'm an introvert. I'm also very guarded. You're the same way in that sense. So how we even got together, I think it's totally a God thing.
I think they did. We were thrown together in this pool where we had to work really hard together, or we were going to fail. And neither of us like failure either.
No.
so,
Yeah, and just traveling together and spending all that time together, being on the same wavelength together almost 24/7, right? I think when I remember on one of our trips, you started to open up a little bit about your life.
Well, that was in New York when you invited me down for a drink after everything was over and we were able to relax a little bit.
Decompress.
We started to open up to each other a little bit.
That was when we first did our Macallan 18s.
And it just kind of slid from there into a deeper and deeper relationship. Yeah.
And I agree. It's just like everybody else. Like, you got to write a story. You got to write the book. And I feel like it's been 3 years since kind of the initial conversation and the thought about recording your story.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people don't know this, but I would be at your house. We would sit there for hours talking, and I would record your conversation, our conversation. And then what I would do is I would take that back and file those away, on my computer, but I would also type out word verbatim.
Did you really?
I did, and you didn't know that, but because that's how I,
process.
But I would type out verbatim hours of recording. And then, as I was starting to write this book, and I'm a pantser, which means I don't plot anything out, I don't organize my chapters, I just let the story tell me how to write it, right? And I referred back. I'm glad I typed it out, because what I did was I would go and I said, okay, let's cover this today, right? Let's cover the kidnapping today. So I would go through these pages and check off or mark in green. Okay, I've covered that in the book. I'm moving on to the next one. And that's how I did the ghostwriting.
Right.
But you threw me for a loop because you didn't tell me the whole story.
I didn't. I told
and just when I thought I was almost done with the story,
you called me because you were like, well, the doctors told you you can't have kids. Why? This doesn't make sense with what you've told me. I don't understand what it was. Can you help me understand? Mm-hmm. And that was about my first sexual assault. I was 11 years old, and I had shoved that so far down that I didn't even begin to deal with it until I was about 40. It was just, I was so young, and what happened was so violent, and it went on for what felt like forever. And I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't deal with the whys of it. I mean, not that I ever said, why me? I've never in my life said, why me? Because bad things can happen to anyone, mm-hmm. right? I mean, I did ask God to put me in other families many, many times, but he never listened. I just don't think that was meant to be my path. And so you and my husband, until the book, you and my husband were the only people I've ever told about that incident, mm-hmm. because it shattered me as a kid. Mm-hmm. I didn't go out for a year after that. I started wearing incredibly different clothing. Like, I got rid of any dress that I had. I wore really tight jeans, like jeans so tight I'd have to use pliers
or something
to get them to zip up, and I dress in really baggy tops, and to try to hide myself from people. And like I said, I didn't go out except to school or events with adults where I was with an adult, and so I was okay, mm-hmm. right? But my dad tried to get me to go out with friends in the evenings, and I was just no, I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Yeah. And it took me, I think it's the other incidences that happened after that got me to realize, or that were where I came to realize that it didn't matter what I did. That because of the environment I was in, these pedophiles were going to keep coming after me. Mm-hmm. And they were mostly adult men, right?
Yeah.
And in great professions, businessmen, doctors.
Well, you were in Rochester, where there's the Mayo Clinic.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So prestigious men in our community, and in the 80s, in the early 80s, there just wasn't support. There wasn't any support for rape victims, right?
Right.
Lolita had come out, and so sexualizing young teenagers was certainly not abnormal, mm-hmm. right? At least not in the world that I grew up in. Yeah. A lot of men did it. And I unfortunately, we haven't made enough progress in that area even today.
Yeah. Well, and you were amongst prestigious people, but your family weren't necessarily prestigious.
No, we were dirt
Right.
poor.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
we were, because at that time, my father's alcoholism and his heart problems together made it very, he'd get a job, but he wouldn't be able to keep it. So we ended up on welfare. So we were incredibly poor, right? And that also made me a bit of an easier target, I think, right?
Yeah.
The throwaway girl, right? I often felt like the throwaway girl, the one who, because I was poor, wasn't worth the effort because I was just gonna not make anything of my life anyway.
Not to mention your copper hair. Like, I'm sure you stood out.
Yeah, I did.
Right, with your bright red hair. And
There's not a lot of redheads in the world to begin with. We're only like 1 or 2% of the population, and in Minnesota, there's a lot of blondes. I mean, there's a lot of Nordic background in Minnesota, and so yeah, I did stand out. I would have strangers come up and try to touch my hair when I was a kid growing up, just on the street, walking by, you know, touching my hair, like, you have beautiful hair. And that also made, I think that was part of what attracted some of these guys. Right?
Yeah. You were exotic.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, when I was writing this book, so there's a saying that you should write drunk and edit sober.
Oh, really?
And that authors are always cold because we're always living in drafts. It's just like the manuscript is never done. There's always something to tweak, to edit, to write, to rewrite. And I think I was pretty much drunk the whole 3 years that we were on this journey
had
together.
to get drunk after writing some of it, if not right. You know,
Well, when you told
while
me
writing
about
it.
the 11-year-old incident, that scene, oh my gosh. So this is a nod to our amazing husband, right? Because I would sit there all day, 12 hours straight, just to write one chapter.
But that chapter's hard.
It was a hard chapter.
I mean, look, I lived through it.
But I was drunk that whole 11, 12 hours and didn't eat anything. And my husband, Joe, was just like, are you going to eat? I was like, no, I can't. But, you know, and then he brought in food for me and I scarfed it down and then I was right back there. And it took me one day to write that chapter, but it also took me
It took you a while to get over it.
To write another chapter.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Just
this
even
book
writing
comes
it
with
was
like trigger
traumatizing.
warnings left and right. But I feel honored that I was able to write your story.
Well, and I appreciate it because many, many people offered to write my book, or offered the suggestion that I should write a book. So your offer of, hey, I'll write your story, I think it's the only way that for me it could have been done. So I'm honored that you wanted to write it.
Well, we are so close to it being published. And I know that we talked about traditionally publishing the book.
We did.
Yeah. Why did you choose to go with a hybrid publisher or to self-publish?
I think because the traditional publishing routes might take too long. I am sick. I do have cancer, right? And at this point, nobody knows how much time I have. I could have a year, I could have 5 years, 8 years. And I want this story out there where I can still talk about it, where I can still, you know, do podcasts or reach out to people and try to reach those people while I'm still here.
Yeah. And you live in Seattle now, but that's not the case for much longer.
I know, my husband and I are moving to Kansas next week.
Okay, why Kansas?
We wanted to live out in the country. We wanted a slower pace of life, and I needed to be near a great cancer center. So it turns out that Kansas was the ideal kind of location for us.
And more sunshine, which Seattle, we all know.
8 months of clouds, at least, if not rain.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited that you're going to be a little bit closer to me in Oklahoma. And I'm also excited that we've got 2 launch parties and book signing events scheduled in which you're going to come down to Oklahoma and do that. So we'll make sure that we mention that in the notes in the Facebook Live.
Yeah, I'm really excited about those.
Me too. And March 30th is when the book comes out. We've already got some beta readers in the thick of it. I've gotten some preliminary feedback. You know, they all are hooked on the book, and they definitely have to take it in spurts. It's not for everybody, but it is definitely...
Yeah, it's certainly not your light, I want to relax Friday night fiction.
Yeah, no rom-coms, no cozy mysteries.
But it is worthwhile if you have been in that situation, or even if you have a really good friend who's been in those situations, to understand what they go through and how hard it is to recover.
Yeah.
Right? That it takes years so that you can be a great support to them. Right?
Yeah. And you're very brave to share your story. I'm glad you found that one person who made all the difference in your recovery, and that you have an amazing husband. You've been married for how long now?
22 and a half years.
22 and a half
Yeah,
years.
we've
with
been
two
together
beautiful
for
sons in college.
Both of our sons are in college. Yeah.
Yeah.
One graduating this year, one just starting this year. But yeah,
So to quote what you said, there is light at the end of the tunnel
there is.
if you're willing to face your demons.
Right.
So, so before we wrap up, is there anything you want to say? Anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to share?
I don't think yet. No, I mean we'll have more chances to talk to people who are interested in this book.
Yeah.
And make a difference.
Okay. Thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Go ahead and stop it.